I'm the co-director of FD13, an artist residency program across Minneapolis and St. Paul. We bring artists from across the globe to the Twin Cities to make new work, often a performance, and present it live in public. I want to say thank you to Company and the team here that has worked fabulously with us to organize this event. Also to Seder Press, who published Johanna Hedva, our speaker tonight. Her book On Hell will have copies of the book available for purchase after the event. And you can see Cameron, Mariana in the back regarding purchasing those. I also want to say a huge, huge thank you to the Goethe Institute in Chicago, who supported Johanna's residency project, to the Future Aquarium Lab and Artist Space in South Minneapolis, who hosted Johanna earlier this week, as she did a writing workshop on mythology, astrology, and storytelling. And I see a few of you who were there in the crowd tonight. And I also want to say thank you to Sector 2337 in Chicago, who are hosting a kind of sister event to this talk that you're going to experience tonight in Chicago this Saturday at 7 p.m. If you know anyone who lives in the city, definitely give them a heads up. And with that, I'm just going to quickly read Johanna's bio. Johanna Hedva is a fourth generation Los Angelina on their mother's side, and on their father's side, the grandchild of a woman who escaped from North Korea. Hedva is the author of the novel On Hell, 2018, Seder Press. Their performances and visual work have been shown at Machine Project, Human Resources LA, the Getty's 2013 Pacific Standard Time, the LA Architecture and Design Museum, and the Museum of Contemporary Art on the Moon. Their essays, poems, and fiction have appeared in Triple Canopy, Black Warrior Review, The White Review, Entropy, Mask Magazine, 3 AM, and others. Their ongoing project, This Earth Our Hospital, includes the essays Sick Woman Theory and In Defense of Depersons. And most recently, it includes Letter to a Young Doctor, which you'll hear a little bit of tonight. And that piece was published by Triple Canopy in January 2018. Here with us, we have Lara Mimosa Montes, who's the senior editor at Triple Canopy. She's also a writer based across New York and Minneapolis. She holds a PhD in English from the Graduate Center. Her poems and essays have appeared in Art Critical, Bomb, The Third Rail, and elsewhere. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lara to say a few words about our partner, Triple Canopy.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you, Sarah. This has been a really wonderful event to be putting together, and so I'm very touched, as I think all of us are, for the turnout. Really quickly, I just want to say a few words about Triple Canopy and also just the space. If you need to use a bathroom at any point, like, you can turn right around the corner and there's a bathroom right here. If you need to step out for some air, there's a door right here. There's also another exit that way. Let's see. Okay, so I'm senior editor of Triple Canopy, and I just want to talk a little bit about Risk Pool, which is the new issue that we launched a couple of months ago in January, for which Johanna and I have been working on a piece for quite a while together, and so I'm really excited that they will be reading from that piece tonight. Okay, so Risk Pool, quick preview, and then start the reading. You ready? So Risk Pool basically is centered on this idea of how are sickness and wellness defined today and by whom? What are the effects of these definitions, these acts of naming and describing? And so Risk Pool is really interested in these kind of themes of collective care, the way social justice might resonate with healing, as well as our relationship to the medical industrial complex and the way that is carried across through different narratives and art forms. That being said, very excited for Johanna's reading, and let's start here. Thank you again.
Yow, now listen, motherfuck, if not nihilism, what? After the children learn to read, then what? They hear the noise of the drag of their bodies dragged around this place, meat eat men, shoot moan go, meals money market, And they see they have no place, no power, only gravity, so then what? They can get a tattoo, they can like a song. Is that freedom? Or is it just more gravity? You know, you put the word advise in an email, you get flagged. You know that, right? Unix toadfish, you get flagged. Artichoke with a capital A, flag. Big S sex, flag. Also big N nerd and little F fangs. This is true. The government, they're poets. They're word hunters. Motherfuck, you can't ask me what you're asking me questions like these and think there will be answers. What do you want to know, mama? Why you come here to ask me this? I wouldn't know anyway, I'm not on. 8 almost 9 years off. I was 17 when I went in 2005, 8 years ago, and now that I'm out, part of the program is that I still have to be off for 10 shit-eating years. I have to be off, that's what. So now I get my news like a too ripe fart, which means I get it after they've been holding it in all day, which means I don't get any new news. Nope, I don't know what anything is anymore. Of course that's what you imagine. Of course I can't possibly be, what's the word, ahem, relevant? Yeah, obviously I lost things other than the goddamn internet when I was in. Lost chocolate, for example. How about that? I was addicted to that shit for 6 years before I went in. Yeah. Since I was 11. Ate it every day of my life. There's no chocolate in prison. Yeah. Duh. It's like, girl, it's a non-chocolate kind of place. Not a chocolate. First thing I did when I got out was get a chocolate bar. But I'd lost the taste for it. Tastes like dirty smoke to me now. I'd remembered it being sweet, but it's not. You know. It made my mouth sticky as shit, like tired fucking old dirt. I got tired. It got lost forever. Fuck it. I lost all the friends I had on, and obviously lost my convictions, my resistance, my quote-unquote insurrectionary tendencies, my fuck my father, fuck all everything. But losing the taste for chocolate, I don't know, that did probably bigger damage. In the way that'll crush a bitch. It's a cute little malady to have, right? The world has bigger problems, right? Sorry motherfuck, what did you ask me? Oh yeah, about the words. Yeah, I'm off, but being in the world even for this year, I still find this all the fuck out. I mean, who do you think I am? Oh that's right mama, you think I'm Lil. Ear. Ella. Vent. Yeah, I mean 8 years off, sure I get it, but it's not hard to find out. I know the words, they sailed through the air, it was like the air was singing. That's what the government does, isn't it? It sings to you without you knowing it, and every morning you have a song in your head and you don't know how it got in there, it just sounds like your own voice. So now you motherfuck, you want to know if I know the words they wait for? That's your first question for me. Think about that words have become so important that you start us off like this because the government fucking waits for them. Every day they are waiting for them to appear, like Jesus cocksucking Christ Lord, the cock has risen. Men in power waiting to read the words package. Chameleon man, frog legs. Beef. Market. Garbage, speed bump, hate. Fashionable, utopia, freedom. Cocaine, white noise, pink noise. Pink noise, ha. Now what could that be that means anything to the goddamn United States government? A pink asshole puckering up noise like a little shit seepage? I told you these guys are just waiting the fuck around to suck a god's dick. Me nah. Now I have my own favorite words. Words are like car sort of motion in themselves. They can move things around, they can get high up there, and you in fact don't have to wait for them at all. That's what those guys get so wrong. The words take you. They just fucking go and bang, that's it. And me. Fuck, I want to go now. Yeah, I'm fucking sick of fucking waiting. That's what this is all about. That's all you need to know or care about. That I want to fly, I want to fly, I want to fly, I want to fly. I want. Fuck. I want to get the fuck off this fucking ground. I don't want to talk about the government and what they want. Motherfuck, don't make me do that. For 8 years I did what they wanted. Now I do what what I want. What is there? There's a lot. The flying words. Let me tell you some flying words so you can get how they move. Methods of lift: dynamic lift, static lift, powered lift, angle of sweep, flying wing, rotary wing, dihedral angle, polyhedral, variations along the span, flarecraft, dependent drag, sea skimmer, wing and ground effect, thrust, propeller, lifting body, up, go. Hear that, motherfuck? Just listen to them. Up, go, 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 go.
So now I'm going to read something in my own voice, even though that was too, maybe. This is an excerpt of Letter to a Young Doctor, which was published in the Triple Canopy issue called Risk Pool. And it's about 15 minutes. Dear Erica, I have to say, wait, before I start, Erica is a real person also who wrote to me, and I didn't know them, and they wrote me an email maybe like in 2016, and so I finally got it together to write back to them. So this is that letter. Dear Erica, you wrote me asking if I can think of a way, any way, that healing might happen within the current institution of the medical industrial complex and its attendant oppressions. You are currently a medical student set to begin your residency this year. I found out that they graduated. The importance of finding a way is urgent, you wrote, because you will soon be seeing patients who come to you to be healed in hospitals, ERs, clinics, and you'll give them treatments that will decide their lives. You feel uncertain if your chosen path as a doctor at this moment in history can also be a path of healing. You wrote, quote, I am someone who will soon be a physician attempting to care for people, and yet I find that I still don't know what healing means. I could graft myself onto that same sentence, but from a different position. I am someone who will be the recipient of attempts at care from institutions and practitioners of healing, and yet I find that none of us really know what healing means. It meant a lot to me that you used the word attempting. You are younger than me, 27, you said. You are the first-generation American child of immigrants, and you pointed out we share Korean heritage, particularly a grandmother who escaped North Korea during the war. You asked me a lot of questions in your letter, and they all felt like questions I asked myself. They seem to be variations of asking, what are we going to do? Which I think is the same as asking, how can we heal? I've come to understand that the conflation of these two questions is crucial not only to finding a way toward healing, which is to say, finding the way that is healing, but also toward how political resistance might work, toward justice. Keeping this fact that healing and justice might be the same, always present in your thoughts, is one way I can think of that might answer your questions. For some of us, there is a relationship between healing and justice because what oppresses us has also made us suffer trauma and its accompanying symptoms. Oppression, domination, and violence live first and foremost in our bodies. As much as they are ideological systems, their effect is always material. They deal in matter, flesh, bones, blood. They pierce tissue with bullets, crack necks with boots, make stomachs chew on their own acid out of hunger, imprison bodies in small, lightless rooms made of concrete. They flood brains and nervous systems with adrenaline and panic. On the less dramatic side, they work insidiously. They instantiate and reinstantiate memories of unhelpful doctors and police who are not figures of help or safety at all, but of violence and terror. They invalidate and dismiss experiences of pain and suffering, especially such experiences that they've directly caused. They deny access to medications and therapies. They frighten and alienate with categories that pathologize and discriminate. And they construct a world whose very premise insists that suffering, illness, disability, and fragility are abnormal and wrong, and banishes those who experience such stuff. So the process of healing is a way of reimagining a political future for the social body as much as it is about finding ways to care for and survive in our individual bodies. And it should go without saying that bodies are fragile things. That's what makes them different from ideologies. They are bound to matter. They are flesh that can be touched, held, scarred, that will decay, that will remember. For this next part, I need to be hydrated. Okay. I received your letter months ago and have not been sure how to respond, although I've thought about it every day. I finally started writing a response from a German hospital during January and February, where I was for 3 weeks in the psych ward for depression. For most of my hospitalization, I was unsure that I would survive, and so responding to you felt serious and fateful, something I must take care of if I wasn't going to make it. This letter, then, is a document of emergency. I wrote it thinking it was one of my last attempts at communication, and in many ways I was trying to communicate to myself as much as I was to you and the questions you asked. If I could articulate something about healing to you, maybe it would articulate healing for me. I wrote it by hand on pieces of printer paper that the nurses gave me from their station. I'd walk down the hallway in my pajamas and knock on the glass. I had to wait for them to unlock the door, then I'd make the gesture of writing by hand because I didn't know the German words. It strikes me that I chose to write to you, a stranger, while I was hospitalized. When I was speaking and interacting with doctors and nurses multiple times a day about these same questions. Instead of walking down the hallway, tapping on the glass, and trying to have a discussion about the relationship between trauma and justice with the people who are trained professionals in the field of medical care, I directed my voice in your direction. You who I've never met, may never meet, who felt very far away, across a distance that was dark and unfamiliar. I think this reveals how vast the distance feels between patient and doctor. For patients, it often feels like trying to connect with a stranger with whom you have no chance of actually connecting. Many chronically ill and disabled people face this dilemma. We are forced into long-term relationships that are devoid of the things, trust, intimacy, that a long-term relationship needs to work. You might wonder what place an emotion like trust has in the science of medicine, but if you take anything from this, I want it to be that trust is the most important thing a doctor and her patient can share, because trust is what keeps people from falling apart, and it's what puts broken ones back together. And in the cases where it feels like the brokenness is all there is, trust can offer a small encouragement that the brokenness is bearable, that it can be borne, that it can be reframed as not brokenness at all, but simply as the different parts that are there to work with. Trust is the only force I can think of that might alleviate the vast distance between us, as well as the vast distances between the many parts of myself, not because it will diminish the distance, but because it will honor it. It will acknowledge that it's here. A therapist once asked me to define trust, and I found that I had no answer. After years of feeling my way toward a definition, the best I came up with is that trust is not a permanent state that can be attained, but only a sign of the possibility that unbearable things can be bearable, that they can be together again, or for the first time, no matter how temporary that moment might be. And even if they never come together, that too can be born. Another therapist recently told me his definition of trust. Trust is that you are here. I thought of flesh, decaying, painful, remembering, dancing, laughing, lingering, bearing, that is bound to being here. I'm out of the hospital for now, and though it feels like the emergency has been paused, I know it will return. In a follow-up appointment, a nurse expressed his shock at my certainty. "You are so sure," he said. "Yes, aren't you?" I said. He was silent for a moment and then said, "Yes, but normally patients aren't so professional about it." When I tell this story to abled people, or other stories I have about my inextricable lifelong relationship with doctors, hospitals, therapists, medications, and the medical industrial complex, I've noticed that they have a hard time understanding the certainty I have, that such things are not only inevitable in my life, but main players. They balk at the fact that I will have to take medication until I die. They say, "But don't you think you're giving your illness too much space?" That I would be certain I'll return to the hospital seems to betray everything they presume is true about hospitals, which I gather is the presumption that hospitals are a rare and bizarre interruption of normal life. How can I explain that the equipment and smell of hospitals, the wan light and horrid linoleum floors, are as familiar as memories of my childhood home? That the routine appointments that take up my time, in-home care when needed, twice-a-week physical therapy, weekly psychotherapy, bi-weekly meetings with my social workers, monthly checkups with my general practitioner, they are as woven into my daily life as work, sleep, and having tea with a friend. In honest, neutral terms, without tragic drama or empowering vindication, I understand that no matter where I sit or sleep in this life, I will be doing it in the house of illness. Everything about living in this house is difficult, but there's a pernicious difficulty in trying to communicate these experiences to a world so structured by ableism. Sometimes it feels like the most unbearable part of it all. It's not so much that articulating the experiences is difficult, although it surely is, but that few really know how to hear and understand them from a non-ableist perspective. There is often the fantastical expectation that I have a true or a real self, and those sick, mad Crip Selves are not really me. But remember how ideologies work. As much as they settle into your bones, they also insidiously structure your world. Ableism makes it normal to insist, violently and subtly, that everyone has the unlimited capacity to work and produce according to the standards of the systems in power. It makes it normal to think of disability as something that one suffers from and can overcome or transcend, of chronic illness as something one needs to be strong about, of bouts of illness as disruptions of normal life. We've all been conditioned to expect that such perspectives are the norm, so much that we don't even think about it when we do them ourselves. Some of the most frustrating encounters I've had with ableism have been in conversations with people who are chronically ill or disabled themselves. And it's taken me years to understand how often I've had and still have ableist expectations of myself. Even in the hospital ward, I pushed myself to meet the deadline for this article because I saw its completion as a measure of my worth. Maybe I don't have to explain it to you, Erica, how being alive in my body is to be alive always in a hospital. Since you, a young doctor, and I, a professional patient, live and work under the same roof of this house of illness. Maybe you already see that the self I am in the hospital is a no less normal part of the self I am at home or in the world. Maybe you already understand that your profession ought to aim for honoring the many parts and the distances between them, and the possibility that such distances might never diminish. I'm learning to figure the self admitted to hospitals with psychosis, the self who is dissociated, the self who is medicated, as no different and no less than the self who is working here at my desk, the self who is publishing essays and novels, the self who is laughing and dancing. Let me ask you to learn this too, to learn this with me. Let's remind each other. Trust is that you are here. Yours, Johanna Hedva.
Let that settle in for a second. Take a breather, right? It was the look.
Yeah.
It was really great to hear you reading that out loud because there are aspects of the letter that resonated with me in hearing you read it, especially the trust that you are here. That felt like so important, particularly in this space, and just again, that recognition and acknowledgement of being here with others, and like just this thing that I'm trying to be more intentional about, and maybe you are as well, of, you know, where are you when you are? Where are you when you're speaking, when you're sharing, when you're doing this intimate work that is about healing, that is about justice, that is about trust, as you say, and trying to connect that again with this sense of presence.
Can I say, Lara was the presence for the writing of this article for the entire process, which was like a year and a half.
We've been talking for a while.
Yes.
And yesterday was the first time we met.
Yes, like
in real life.
It feels really important and big that this is happening here and that you're here, and I just want to say that. It's like,
well, it's weird. I mean, like, well, I was talking with a few people just in, you know, like, hi, have you been here before? You know, just kind of people who I didn't recognize, because there are a lot of faces here that I don't recognize, and there are some that I do, and it's like beautiful to have both of that feeling in the room, and just again being reminded, like, you are here, you made it here, and the kind of miracle of, like, when we started writing, it was before the elections.
yes,
and
which is not, you know, I mean, I was in the hospital like shortly after that.
I think some of us might have felt like we were in our own version.
Yes.
And so many people who I kind of, you know, had just said, hi, how's it going? Had said, oh, I'm here because I read Sick Woman Theory. And I said, yeah, me too. In a way, that's how I'm here. That's how I arrived here, or that's how I arrived in your inbox.
Yes.
And so it was pretty miraculous to be like actually speaking to someone who had just been mostly emailing
Yes.
with. And so it's exciting to hear this, and then again to just have that sort of feeling of what does it mean to trust within this space that we're here together and we're kind of committed to some sense of accountability, some sense of wanting to be with others, to share with others, to be accountable and responsible for others. And so I was wondering to kind of bring it back to that first part of the reading, before you physically entered the being with us, magically appeared. How do you reconcile the kind of selves that emerge in the novel On Hell and the self that materializes in the essay?
Yes. So I should say that On Hell, this video that you saw is an excerpt from the novel. And the novel I began writing in 2013, and I started writing it right after this list of words that the NSA was flagging was leaked. So those words like chameleon man, and
That's
beef,
a flagged word.
Chameleon man, beef. These are like legitimately flaggable as potential terrorist activity if you were to use them in an email. Market, like I'm going to the market, flag. That was 2013, and I finished writing it in 2015. So the fact that it's in the world is also kind of a time warp. But I see both of these projects. This project around disability and ableism is very much like a memoir, nonfiction essay voice. But I see them as kind of trying to deal with the same things, the same topics. The medical industrial complex, the prison industrial complex, the body in those places. The fragility of bodies and the resilience of bodies in those places. But writing it, like I was saying to you yesterday, like for me, I feel like I'm much stronger as a fiction writer. I feel more comfortable there, and less so when I'm talking from a position of like, it's me. But I think the reason is because in fiction, you get to kind of like conceal your authorial position behind a character, and you work really hard to do that, in fact. But in essays, you have to work very hard to reveal it. You have to be like, here is who I am, here is what I've been thinking about, here's what I used to think and what I think now, and how I got there, like all of that.
It's a faux transparency.
It's very odd, yes. It's like a performed thought process. Like, yes.
Right. And what in the novel, I was thinking that it was really striking to me to read the fiction because I'm used to your nonfiction voice, right? Like the one maybe that I get in emails in our own exchange, but also like in Sick Women Theory, in Defense of D-Persons, which came out a little bit after that, a letter to a young doctor. I'm sort of used to you, like I expect you to take on a kind of critical authority.
Yes.
I'm like, who would know? I mean, that's why I wrote you in a sense, and maybe why Erica wrote you, that performative sense of expertise that you might own.
Like this.
Well, whether intentional or not, this sense of like, I remember when we were talking about risk pool, and we were like, who are the people that we really want to have in this room, in this conversation? And I remember you were like, I was like, Johanna Hedva, like that. And it was in a sense because you had published Sick Woman Theory, but also because you had, like, there wasn't a book on the table. No, there wasn't really a reputation for like, oh, this person would clearly like have a vested interest because they work for this organization.
Right.
Like it was a sense of, you must have more to say if this is just where you're starting.
Well, it was it was the beginning. I had never really explained to anybody that I was like living with chronic illness and was disabled. I didn't say I was disabled at that time. Some like close friends knew, one of whom was in the audience. But in general, like I never talked about it. I didn't know how to articulate it. It felt shameful and like something I had to hide. I was like in grad school and struggling. And I would like try to go into my like professor's office and say, well, I don't think I can do that. And they'd be like, why? And I'd be like, you know, like I didn't know how to say it. So Sick Woman Theory was actually, it was the first document of emergency in the sense that I felt like it was an emergency. I didn't know how I was going to survive this thing if I didn't talk about it somehow. And so it really is like a starting point, that essay. And at the time, I really felt that I wrote it for my couple of friends who I knew who were also disabled, chronically ill, dealing with things. You know, especially if you're trans and transitioning, you're bound up in the medical industrial complex. So I had like a few friends that were going through this, and we all sort of were like, how are we gonna live? And it felt like a very desperate moment at the time. So that's where it came from, was writing this, like, oh, we are all kind of experiencing intersections of this non-normative, non-abled body and life.
Right. And when you say how are we going to live, it's also how are we going to help each other live?
Yeah, like
right.
It's because that also became a thing. I mean, I'm sure those of you who are here who have chronic illness or are disabled, like you need an advocate to go with you to the doctor's office because you just get overwhelmed. They start, you know, interrogating you with things and you forget why you're even there. You're like, I'm sorry. So you need your friends to take you. And that's, I think, a huge part of the disabled community that I'm a part of. You know, like even flying here, I stopped in New York and my friend called the airline just to double check that I would have wheelchair service. Just to double check, because that would be huge, you know. So just having like somebody with you to do that and be like, yes, I know.
Something of that friendship or advocate I see also in On Hell and just the relationship between the two main characters. And there's a lot of things going on in that larger work, and so it was great that a piece of it was in the room, and so I really hope that others get to encounter more of it. I'm not someone who writes fiction, although I have these dreams of doing something like autofiction. Yeah, you know, like somewhere
really
like how can we move to like a kind of stranger place where like the line between what's true and what's real ends up becoming like a matter of gossip. You know, like a matter of social record, and it's not clear what in fact is the made up part. And so in thinking about the relationship between the two main characters in the work, I was very excited by the places that it goes genre-wise to kind of make this conversation about how people can advocate for each other, but places it within a scenario of like cyberpunk, steampunk. As we were talking yesterday, right, there are certain literary figures that like bring an energy to the work that is very distinct from the energy of this epistolary essay, which is an essay that's basically written in like a letter form.
Yeah.
Like H.P. Lovecraft,
Yes.
like Clarice Lispector,
Yes.
that these really like beloved figures for a lot of people maybe in this room end up informing that relationship.
Yeah.
And so maybe I wonder if you could talk a bit about the other either literary influences or cinematic influences that kind of helped you produce this fiction world that allows you to work through these similar ideas.
Yeah, we talked about this. I have to kind of confess that I'm like a movie person, like a real one. Not an art person that's interested in movies, no, like a movie person. So I see everything, I really love movies, I'm like working on a horror movie screenplay, like I'm a movie person. I have like framed movie posters in my house. Like I have like the complete DVD collection of Harry Potter, like I'm serious, you know?
Next level.
Yeah, like I'm kind of, yeah. And I feel like this is not necessarily the norm in the art world. But yes, On Hell, well, in the video, the word motherfuck keeps appearing. Motherfuck is a character. There are two characters in the book. The speaking voice that you got to read or hear, whose hacker alias is On Hell, and his interlocutor, which is motherfuck. And I feel like there's this kind of cool trope in, definitely in horror movies, definitely in sci-fi movies, but also in a weird kind of crime and punishment novel, where there's like these two it's like the criminal and the prison guard that's going to bust them out, or like, you know, the person in the system that's actually going to transgress that system and help some kind of escape happen. So that was a huge kind of motivator, or like the structure of that book is that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, like, you know, especially in science fiction and horror literature, you have to kind of account for the voice, like where you're starting from. I think Clarice Lispector does this really well. It's like always kind of like, usually first person, and usually like kind of almost being interrogated and having to tell you how she had a mystical experience upon seeing a cockroach in her kitchen cabinet, for example.
Right. What is that novel called?
The Passion According to G.H.
The
If
Passion
you haven't
According
read
to
it,
G.H.
yes.
Recommended.
Yes.
Sorry for interrupting. I just like had this overwhelming sense of like Clarice Lispector when that piece was being read.
Oh, yay.
I just was like, oh, she's like here.
Oh, great.
That's beautiful. Careful with Clarice. I've been like reading and writing about her, and I've been having dreams about.
Okay, so right just now, when we were getting ready in the house,
Oh
like
my.
the mirror fell down twice. Nobody touched it. There was like a banging around in the back closet. What else happened? Like a bunch of ghost stuff happened.
There's a presence.
Yeah.
There was
the
a
front door like bang.
The front door bang, and I was like, maybe it's my grandma. Maybe I didn't do enough ancestor like offerings today, so that I like quickly did them. But maybe it's Clarice Lispector. We could be so honored.
Yeah, Clarice Lispector. And then yesterday we were also geeking out about films such as Videodrome with Debbie Harry, Cronenberg, Tetsuo,
Johnny Mnemonic, which is one of my
with Keanu Reeves.
yes.
It's been a long time since I've seen that. So then we've got, there's also William Gibson.
Yes,
then
okay.
who's also in the room.
Who is the one epigraph of this book? The novel has a quote opening it, and it's
Neuromancer.
a William Gibson quote. Yes, yes. Oh, yeah. I have to say about Keanu Reeves. This may be off the record, although it's being filmed. My father looks just like Keanu Reeves. So maybe it's ruined for me, but.
Keanu Reeves, Total Recall.
Yes, Oliver Hoven. Yes.
Right.
So the cyberpunk moment, we should talk about this, being in the 80s, and we're not in the 80s anymore, I think informs this novel a lot in the sense that there's this weird kind of, you know, like all of the things that cyberpunk speculated have happened, you know. And even just like Back to the Future 2 came true, you know. Like if Back to the Future 2 was set in 2015, and everything, it was a vision of the dystopian Reagan America when it came out. And it's completely just true now, like everything happened.
Mm-hmm.
Except like the flying skateboard, you have to be very wealthy to buy it. You can't just be like Marty McFly and have one. So I feel like this novel on Hell is a cyberpunk, but like a nostalgic retro, which cyberpunk is.
Sure.
But it's definitely, I'm dating myself with it, I think.
No, it's exciting. You know, those of us who have an affinity, like, you know, we were minding our own, like, why do we have our respective cinephilias?
Yes.
And you were talking about your ancestry, and I was saying, well, I worked at a video store.
You worked in a video
That was
store.
called Video Free. That was like, it opened, it's closed now, but it opened when VHS was like, starting to be archaic. So the thing was DVDs, right? Those were like new. So it was called Video Free for that reason. And it's funny to think about these kind of desires. Like, you know, just us talking and our kind of love for being in the theater and like actually wanting to witness a kind of spectacle.
Yeah.
And I think those films were spectacle in a way that the action movie today, like, doesn't do it.
We were talking about the kind of real generative potential of all these like sci-fi horror, especially in the 80s, of like body transformation, body horror as a genre, which Angel is, and I feel like my entire project on disability and ableism is about body horror and body transformation in a way. Like I could make an argument that this Sick Woman Theory is like a horror essay.
So I want to ask you, like, how do you connect that with bringing it back to the essay, Letter to a Young Doctor, Healing as Reimagining?
Yes.
What does that look like?
It's like, you know, I mean.
How does that transpire?
I think that I have a lot to say about that. Maybe I try to like articulate myself. To me, I really think that transformation is part of the conversation around healing, and not in a cliche way, not in like a cheesy way.
Mm-hmm.
I think that anybody that's kind of grappling with chronic, well, let me say it like this. Everybody in this room will one day be disabled or have a chronic illness. That's how it will work. So when you are all disabled, y'all are going to have to confront this also. There's a reckoning of the limits of the body as well as like the porousness of the body when that happens. So transformation I find to be not necessarily always associated with good things. Like we tend to use it now in some weird self-help way. Transform, overcome. But it's not really like, you know, the original, like Ovid's Metamorphosis, which is one of my favorite texts, is not necessarily like about overcoming, you know, hardship. It's really about this kind of transcendent mutilation that can happen to the soul and the body with a lot of different potential to go either way. So I feel like this kind of reimagining of yourself in a way that could open up these different avenues for shapes and beingness and smells and colors, I think is like one of the ways, at least for me, that I've found to like cope with some of what feels like a limitation, you know?
I was thinking too about, you write how trust is not a permanent state, and you know that kind of tenuous relationship with yourself, right, that might emerge either when you're writing like critical prose or when one finds oneself out in the doctor's office.
Yeah.
And you know, if you've experienced this, you know, maybe this is familiar, that sense of you have like an agenda when you walk into that office. I'm gonna make sure I ask these exact questions. I'm not gonna let that doctor like bully me, like railroad me, steamroll me, right, into like making me think it's one situation and that my like nerves, anxiety, or this is that.
Yeah.
Right, like that they're silly and like, yeah, because I'm so desiring to trust.
Right.
Right, I so want to trust this person. I remember I was like in a class once and the professor had said, it was like on medical ethics or something like this, and they had said the thing that people most want when they go to the doctor's office is not a diagnosis, they want reassurance. Which is to say either reassurance of that they're feeling what they're feeling, or reassurance that there's a name for the set of feelings that they might feel, or that they can expect these feelings will last X amount of time. And it sounds like in your work, and maybe you can talk a bit more about This Earth, Our Hospital, you know, the larger project that Sick Woman Theory and Letter to a Young Doctor are part of, how in that larger project you want to make space for doubt and to seek reassurance maybe elsewhere, or to kind of question what these ideas, ideals about bodily integrity, how they're quite crippling actually.
Yeah. And maybe I should just say that using the word crippling is like an interesting, I mean, because this is like, I feel like we're in a moment right now where we're calling out a lot of language and stuff, but I'm a bit more promiscuous about this kind of thing. Like I don't find it necessarily bad to foreground words that are usually associated with disability in language. I should say that. Like crippling, blindedness. Like one thing, sorry, this is a tangent, but one thing I really have a problem with is like when we're criticizing Trump, we're talking about his like mental health. As though like white supremacy and misogyny are mental illnesses and not ideologies of power. I'm just gonna, like the reason why Trump is a dangerous president is not because he's crazy. I'm just gonna say that once.
Thank you.
Thank you for saying it.
Put it there.
I just feel like, what is up with the New York Times and the New Yorker? It's just like, oh, the State of the Union was like really the state of his mental health. Like, I think that's really a disservice. Anyway. Anyway, yeah, I think that I think that my project is situated in a larger conversation around disability and chronic illness kind of becoming more mainstream, and I think we're talking about it a bit more. Representation is also happening more, like in media and stuff. So I see that I'm in this kind of lineage, but I really think of my project as talking about ableism rather than my particular individual experience of chronic illness or disability. Just like we were talking about this yesterday, like any kind of, identity that is associated with being oppressed, like, there's the token person who becomes a spokesperson for that experience, and I find that that's sort of what's happening. We're in the baby steps of talking about disability. So it's like I'm sort of weirdly tasked with talking about chronic illness for a lot of people. And I don't feel like that at all. I feel like as all of you are individuals, so am I. And the task at hand, I think, should be that we are sharing and talking about our individual and different experiences, how they overlap, how they don't. Maybe if I could just blanket armchair theorize about this, is the systems in power want you to all blend together, right, and to fit well, in one whole, like a peg and a, fit, just sort of be able to line up. So I think it's really important that people who have kind of divergent from the norm experiences are able to articulate all those divergences. And I would say that hopefully that's what I'll be able to do in this project, is kind of put forward some experiences that I've had. But really, I think it's about how, when you put forward those experiences, you are usually met with a wall of ableism, as well as various other isms, because they're definitely yoked to ableism. And I kind of think that ableism is sort of still new in our conversation and our discourse. We're getting better at being able to talk about white supremacy and stuff, but still not, I wish that ableism was getting, was understood as white supremacy really needs ableism to work,
That's important.
Transphobia really needs ableism in order to work. So I would hope that that's what my project can do in some small way, is show how these are all feeding off each other to kind of really, it's all a horror movie to me. I really think this project is a horror movie.
As you say that, I watched the Killing of a Sacred Deer last night.
I downloaded it, but I haven't seen it yet.
Well, we were talking about Nicole Kidman.
Yeah, we were talking about Nicole Kidman because...
And it put me in the mood to watch Nicole Kidman.
Nicole Kidman's natal chart is really tough, I gotta say. I pulled it up the other day and I was like, oh, that's why.
Wait, what is...
Scorpio rising, Mars and Libra in the 12th, opposing Saturn and Aries in the 6th. That's all you need to know.
Put a pin in it. So with that, okay, why don't we open it to some questions, conversation?
I have a question about horror as a genre. I've recently been having a conversation frequently with my partner and I about horror movies and how often the tropes in horror movies are actually just reimagining, or not reimaginings, but we're saying someone's possessed when really they're having an episode of dissociation, or they have I don't know. So how do you? We're having a really hard time reckoning with that. How do we watch movies like The Exorcist and know that that happens to us?
Yeah.
What we're watching happens to us, and it's horrifying, but not in a spectacle kind of way. It's horrifying in I feel trapped in myself way.
Yeah, it does a lot. I really think that horror movies are some of the most generative for thinking through it's like, to me, it's like social realism as a genre. Horror movies are just like documentaries.
Can I ask you, I wanted to ask you this, and I feel like that movie Safe by Todd Haynes, do you read that as a horror movie, or do you experience it as a horror movie?
Okay, so like maybe I'm being a little provocative to say that all horror movies are like social commentary documentaries. But kind of they are, and Safe is that's just regular life. I mean, especially in the 90s, you know, like when she's getting the allergy test. Oh. That's just like, that was on my Snapchat, I feel.
I love the scene in the party with the children, and the child is sitting on her lap, and Julianne Moore is like starting to have an attack, like feelings, and they're starting to. I mean, and you know, Julianne Moore's face is in and of itself something to spend some time with. And Todd Haynes really does right by her.
Yeah,
that was like the first big role that she had.
She was in Shortcuts before that.
Okay.
See, I'm really going to talk about
you want
movies.
to
She was in Shortcuts before that with a fabulous, like, from the waist down nudity scene where she's ironing the skirt. Oh yes, that was like her breakout role, I feel. And then Safe was a little later. Safe was like 94, 95,
something like that.
and Shortcuts was earlier. So I'm sorry. Yeah, I think that that's why I think I like horror movies a lot. There's a really great essay by Colson Whitehead from some years ago, when he wasn't so well known, about his obsession with horror movies, B horror movies particularly. And he talked about how the thing about the monsters always in horror movies is that they are just people who stopped pretending. So great. And then he kind of comes around to the idea that artists are monsters that stopped pretending. So he, I think, has a really great articulation of how horror is generative as a way of thinking through just like, you know, social, political relationships.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, hi.
Hi. So I was wondering if, like to continue this horror thread, the way you're talking about horror kind of reminds me of some various readings and thoughts that I've had about how we approach the grotesque. And I think the grotesque as an open body, artist being grotesque, or this kind of like ugly horror that is so ugly and yet still very intimate at the same time, and that there's like, it's just something that I think about a lot, and I don't know if that, the grotesque, does that fit into horror? Does it include it? Is it outside of it, maybe?
Yeah.
It's very bodily.
Yeah, I think it is. This is not my original idea. There's an essay on the internet by somebody whose name I'm forgetting that argues that horror is just the contemporary version of Greek tragedy. And I think that's correct, totally. Because, you know, tragedy is fundamental to our civilization or understanding of narrative and the development of the self through hardship, which is very, it's like a fundamental cultural value I feel like that we all have. And tragedy as a way of kind of like, you know, not just learning who you are, but like having some kind of potential to like become who you were meant to be. This is what we're talking about in the workshop with fate and stuff, and the destiny of characters. I think that horror is like, you know, is showing you like, well, what if your fate is to, you know, have some horrible thing befall you? And it's really kind of like a management survival course and how to deal with that. So the grotesque is yeah, I think that's kind of in a similar, I don't know if grotesque is maybe a subgenre of horror, but definitely part of it, yeah. Because there are different kinds of, you know, grotesque can function in comedy too, you know, which is fabulous.
It feels like it almost proposes a solution to the conundrum, where we're supposed to be like, no, this is the way it is, and that shock value somehow shakes us down.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I was just saying to you today that I thought that, like, wouldn't it be funny to just think of sick woman theory as like a comedy? Like experimental comedy.
I was thinking of Butoh really when those,
Yes.
because you had told me yesterday that
Yes.
you've studied Butoh and integrated some of that into your performance practices.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so that is certainly has a relationship to the abject, the grotesque.
Yes. Death, decay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And the no theater, which is sort of preceding Butoh. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just going back through my notes. I could talk about horror all day.
Great.
But going back through my notes, you talked about the self I am in the hospital is no less than the self I am at home. And how that basically translates to like the self that you see as broken is no less or no more than the self that you may see as or perceive as put together. And then you also went to how collectively will we live and how can we collectively help each other live. How do you do that when you're just like angry at the world? Because it's just one of those things that I'm dealing with right now where like everyone wants to put me back in this like, well, you shouldn't be angry. Like they like even people that are disabled like me are just like, well, you just have to live authentically. And it's like, okay, but me authentically right now is angry at the systems that are putting me in the place that I am right now, where I'm supposed to be living authentically. Like, how do I do all of that? And I shouldn't be asking you how necessarily, but like, where do you put all of that into place when people are telling me ableist things that are also therefore, like, they're trying to help though.
Yeah. We talked to you a little bit about anger.
Rage I think is huge. It's a huge part of my work. I write about it. I write with it. Well, let me say this. I really think that I think if you don't have rage, it's like index of your privilege. Like.
Can you say that again? Because that was like.
Yeah. If you don't have rage, it's an index of your privilege. Like how much rage you have, to me, shows like how little privilege you have. Like it's a complete proportional index. So tone policing, like if somebody's telling you that you shouldn't be so angry about anything, about racism or ableism or homophobia, tone policing is a sign of privilege, and it's also a sign of able-mindedness, I think. But to be, just like in terms of how are we going to live, I think that there has to be, this is something that took me a long time to realize, there has to be equal parts rage and care. If you only have rage, which we sometimes do, you'll notice it doesn't really, it's not sustainable, and it's not, it's not educative or rehabilitative, or, you can't really, you can burn shit down, which is totally great, and we should all be burning things down, but then you have to still live somewhere, so you gotta build a new place. So I think that, you know what I mean? And I think, this is I think right now we're in a moment where a lot of systems and figures are being burnt down to the ground, which is great, but I really hope that we now start talking about the new things we're gonna build in place. I don't think it's enough to just punish and fire and brimstone cancel. I think we have to talk about the labor of rehabilitation and education. So just personally, I kind of now realize that ableism, is very pernicious. It's in all of us. It's in the, it's like in the drinking water supply. So obviously that's angering and enraging, but it's also it's the world we live in. So we can't just flip the table and leave. Like, we have to still eat somewhere together. So, you know, I think that I'm a bit more maybe moderate about, I don't think we should just cancel people if they say one ableist thing.
It's also important to know, it sounds like people who might say something ableist, something ableist, not perceived as ableist, might be sick.
Well, that's the thing. That's the
You
thing.
don't know.
Like I'm the most ableist person I know because it's very internalized. Like I'm like, you know, and I feel like it's taken me many years of unlearning that. Just like we're all unlearning all of the shit that we've been conditioned to believe. I feel like these are all like journeys that everybody's on. People are at different places in those. If they're willing to do the work to listen to you, if you say like, hey, that's ableist, and they're like, oh, I'm sorry, can you, I think that that's like not a red flag. I think it's good. You know, you may not want to have to do the labor. The burden is always on the oppressed to labor, you know, to do the rehabilitative and educational labor to those with privilege. But I do think that, like, you know, this is the world we live in. And so we have to figure out a way to be with each other. So if you have rage, like, you could start a punk band. You know, you could, like, work with it. I think it's good to have rage. I just think you have to have equal parts care. For yourself and for others, yeah.
Why don't we take one more question and then we'll have some books for sale.
Oh yeah, there's books for sale, and
We'll
I can
sign some
them.
books. There's some seltzer in the back,
Ooh,
and yeah.
stop
one more
with the
question.
seltzer.
That's how we roll in Minnesota. Yeah, back there.
My question is about you're talking about rage and care, and so I think, at least speaking for myself, one form my trauma takes is the desire to like burn it down and run away, and how healing is about learning to stay, and learning how to care about even what I want to burn down, like the ableist people, and and I also think as a disabled person who has these problems, it's very hard for me to create community around myself, to learn these new patterns of care. And I was wondering what your experience around that is, like creating communities of care as a disabled person, and the way that the intersections of oppression and privilege play into that ability to form communities as sick and disabled people.
That's a really great question. That's the main challenge of our lives, I feel, as disabled people. Because as you know, like if you have disabled friends, it's like, I mean, it's kind of hilariously, wonderful in how, like, if you want to go out to dinner, you have like 3 hours of planning. You got to call every place and see if it's accessible. You got to see what's on the menu. You like make the caravan parade to the restaurant, and then there's one step, and then we have to redo the whole thing. I have to say, just personally, I didn't really find my Crip fam until I published Sick Woman Theory, and it really was. I think of it kind of like almost like an online dating profile, that essay, where I was like, here's what I have, and here's what I am seeking,
Wow.
So, and then I met so many amazing, wonderful, like, people through it, but I think it was that I had to say it first, which is really hard, and it took me, I published that essay when I was 31. So, for most of my 20s, I was just kind of like suffering alone and pretending I didn't have it nearly that bad, that kind of thing. I think that the conversation is happening, though, like around trauma, and especially like if you're disabled, a lot of the time you have PTSD just from going to the doctor, which is a whole other thing. It's like a next level PTSD. because you probably already have PTSD for some other reason, and then you go to the doctor to get diagnosed, and then you get it again. So I think that these conversations are already happening a little bit, and I don't know, what worked for me is by just really articulating it. And it's not easy. I'm not saying like I published the woman theory and everything was like great. It was actually not. It was quite overwhelming and difficult. But I think like what I've noticed is that, this is what a therapist said. The therapist said, trust is that you are here, which is similar to what you're saying about burning things down, but then needing to care enough to like stay there. And this same therapist told me that a lot of the time people want to help, they just don't know how. So you have to really articulate it to them. And if you articulate it to them in a way that they feel like, okay, yeah, I can do that, then a lot of the time, like, it'll work out. You just have to, you know, a lot of the time people want to help, they really don't know how. And it's all bound up in shame. You really see that when, you know, white people are talking about race. You know, they're like, oh, and they do it all bad. So a lot of the time you just have to be like, here's what you have to, like, read this, read this, read this. Don't say that.
It sounds like you're talking about like hope, kind of like that's something I feel like I struggle with because I want to speak up like through my shame, but I'm also being told to shut up.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's a struggle. And
yeah.
I mean, like a symptom of depression is feeling hopeless.
Yes.
So yeah, it's encouraging. I mean, like I know to speak up, and I do often. But thanks for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. I mean, I think we're learning. Like I'm learning from you as much as you're learning from me. Like we're just trying to do this. And I think that the issue a lot of the time with chronic illness and disability is that, like I'm saying, you'll all be disabled someday. It's true. So just like, you know, get ready. And you can be friends with some of us now. You're brave enough. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe that's a good way to end.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cool. So thank you to Company. Thank you to Sarah
Yes,
Klugish
thank you
and
for that.
FD13. Thank you to all of you for being here. And join us for Seltzer. Buy some books. Venmo and debit and credit cards accepted.
Yes.
Cool.
Cool.
Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
And if you're going to hair and nails, drive safe.